2,000 years ago, a man was executed on a wooden cross in a small province of the Roman Empire. His name was Jesus of Nazareth, to some a prophet, to others a threat. But why did he have to die? Was it faith, politics, or destiny? Behind the story of the crucifixion lies a complex web of power, betrayal, and belief, a moment where religion and empire collided. This is the real story behind the crucifixion.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're taking a historical scalpel to what is probably the single most analyzed event in Western history, the final week of Jesus of Nazareth. And what we want to do is set aside the theological narrative just for a moment.
Right.
Not to dismiss belief, but really to get a clearer understanding of the facts, the political and historical forces that led to his execution.
It's the ultimate historical paradox, isn't it?
It really is.
I mean, you have a man known throughout Galilee as a healer, someone who spoke only of compassion, of forgiveness, of feeding the hungry, and he ends up suffering this brutal death reserved for a Schwerverbrecher, a serious criminal.
A state criminal.
Exactly. And our sources really demand that we confront that stark contrast.
And the most compelling piece of evidence that this was fundamentally a political execution is right there in the historical record of the scene. It's mid-morning, the execution is carried out, and above him is a sign.
Yes.
A sign that tells the whole story, emblazoned in Latin, Iveruarai, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Eudeorm.
Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews.
King of the Jews.
That single inscription, which, the Romans insisted on posting, is just crucial. It wasn't an accidental detail.
Yeah.
It framed his death as a deliberate punishment for treason against the empire. He was executed not for, say, blasphemy against Judaism, but for daring to claim a title that belonged only to the Roman emperor.
So if we really want to distinguish between the historical facts and religious belief, we have to mentally transport ourselves back.
We do.
Back to Jerusalem around the year 30 CE. We're talking about a metropolis under occupation, just ready to explode.
Exactly. I mean, today, the traditional site, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, stands over the place called Golgotha.
Yeah.
But historically, we need to zoom right in on the specific context of that 1 week.
Okay.
We know, as an established fact, that Jesus had spent about 3 years as a wandering preacher, mostly operating outside the urban centers, in Galilee.
He was building a following there, right, often among the poor and the marginalized.
Yes, his ministry was one of sort of grassroots reform. But his entire trajectory pivoted when he deliberately led his followers to Jerusalem for Passover.
And this wasn't just any religious holiday.
Not at all. It was the most vital Jewish pilgrimage festival. It would draw hundreds of thousands of people into a very confined, very tense space.
And that convergence, that just created maximum volatility. I mean, you have these massive, religiously fervent crowds celebrating their freedom from historical oppression.
The exodus from Egypt, specifically.
Not from Egypt, all while they are under the watchful and very nervous eyes of the Roman occupation force.
The Romans always anticipated Arthur uprising during Passover. And what does Jesus do?
Right.
He arrives just 1 week before his death, choosing the busiest, most politically sensitive week of the entire year.
And that's the question we really have to unpack. Why choose the crucible? I mean, if the goal was quiet spiritual renewal, he could have just continued his mission in the relative calm of the Galilean countryside. But arriving in Jerusalem during Passover, that was a guarantee of maximum visibility. And, inevitable confrontation. It signals intent.
It signals a calculated willingness to challenge authority head-on. And our mission today is to trace the steps of that confrontation, which he provoked against two powers simultaneously.
The existing Jewish religious order.
And the Roman occupation force, which was obsessed with maintaining roux, or peace, during the festival.
Which takes us directly into how this all began. Our sources define it as Jesus the Reformer and the engineering, the calculated entrance.
At his core, Jesus was a Jewish reformer. He wasn't trying to create a new religion.
No.
He was trying to improve the existing one. His primary aim was to pivot the faith away from these rigid, formal, ritualistic actions, what the sources call formal and tanen, toward a spirituality that was governed more from the heart.
That focus on the heart over, say, the ledger book, that puts him in direct conflict with the religious bureaucracy that ran the temple.
Absolutely. And while he shared goals with other figures like John the Baptist, calling people to repentance and true holiness, Jesus possessed an uncanny ability to inspire mass feeling.
Charisma.
His charisma, coupled with his willingness to criticize the establishment, it automatically made him an Aufweigler.
An instigator. An agitator.
An agitator, yes, in the eyes of the authorities.
So he decides to use this charisma, not subtly, but with a piece of, well, intentional political street theater. The sources are very clear on this.
Yes, they are.
The arrival in Jerusalem was not spontaneous. It was a planned inscenarum, a calculated staging intended to set a clear, unmistakable sign of his identity and his mission.
And the staging was meticulous. They approached the city from the east, coming over the Mount of Olives. Now, this route was just loaded with prophetic significance, referencing ancient scriptures about a future king.
And they descended into the Kidron Valley, and crucially, the sources note they paused. They paused to cleanse themselves at the recently excavated Shiloh pool.
The Shiloh Taish, yes.
And only after that purification did they ascend to the temple using the ancient, newly paved main road.
So the physical route itself was a processional statement. And the centerpiece of this whole calculated spectacle, was Jesus' mount.
A humble donkey.
Riding on a humble donkey.
Yeah.
And this was just profoundly symbolic. It's a direct reference to the messianic prophecies of Zechariah depicting a king of peace.
A stark contrast to the war horses the Romans would ride into the city.
Exactly. And his small band of followers, and the sources suggest maybe only a dozen, were actively participating in this initial stage.
So a tiny group.
A tiny group, but they weren't whispering. They were shouting these loaded titles: King, Son of David, and the deeply political cry of Savior, Hoshea-na.
Which basically translates to save us now.
Save us now. I mean, this is where the historical analysis provides a crucial correction. While it was a carefully calculated staging to attract maximum tension and force a reaction, we should not imagine the entire city stopped dead.
Right. It wasn't like a modern parade.
No. Most of the hundreds of thousands of pilgrims, they were focused on finding lodging, securing sacrifice animals, performing their own duties. They likely missed the event entirely.
So it was a targeted piece of propaganda then. It wasn't aimed at the average pilgrim. It was aimed at those watching from the temple and the Roman fortress.
Precisely. And the Romans were absolutely watching. Roman intelligence, represented by figures like the centurion Longinus in our sources, they were immediately monitoring this commotion.
And their initial report must have sounded almost ridiculous.
You can imagine a provincial healer from Galilee riding on a donkey being hailed as king by a tiny group of followers.
But the word king was enough. They didn't care if it was a humble king, a bescheidener König, as the sources say.
No, their singular mandate from Emperor Tiberius was maintaining Ru. Peace, any political title, any messianic claimant was a potential source of Aufruhr and uprising that had to be stamped out immediately.
The Roman system wasn't interested in theology.
Not at all. They were interested in statistics. One man claiming kingship could turn into 10,000 rioters in the compressed space of Passover Jerusalem.
So he was put on the watch list instantly.
Instantly.
And this sets the scene for the collision. Because Jesus wasn't content just to ride into town, he immediately sought out the most contentious flashpoint available, which moves us into the collision course. Law, ego, and the temple economy.
The entrance was directed at the Romans, but his actions immediately following targeted the Jewish establishment. Though he was a devoted Jew, Jesus openly challenged the authority of the Gesetze.
The guardians of the laws.
The guardians of the laws.
Yeah.
The most famous examples are, of course, the Sabbath laws. His teaching was revolutionary in its simplicity. The laws are for the people, not the people for the laws. If you can do good on the Sabbath, then do it. This challenged the entire basis of ritual obedience promoted by the temple hierarchy.
And we get a sense of just how revolutionary this was when we look at the culture of compliance at the time. Our sources reference the Dead Sea Scrolls fragments, the 15,000 text fragments detailing laws and punishments, which you can see now in the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. That level of intense legal scrutiny shows how compliance was, for many, the defining characteristic of holiness.
And Jesus was tearing at that very fabric.
And
the man at the center of that fabric was the high priest, Caiaphas. He was the most powerful Jewish official in the land head of the High Council, tasked with overseeing the purity of the temple cult. But critically, he was also the man tasked by Rome with keeping the peace and enforcing their laws.
Which highlights the immense pressure Caiaphas was operating under. I mean, his power was not autonomous, it was conditional, entirely dependent on the good graces of the Roman administration.
And we see the physical manifestation of this subservience in a really chilling detail. the sacred breast garment used for the upcoming Passover ritual.
Okay.
This most holy, required piece of priestly attire was not kept by Caiaphas. It was stored and guarded by the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate.
Wait, hold on. So the most important religious official in Judea had to go to the Roman occupier and ask permission to wear his own ceremonial clothes.
That's the stunning reality.
Yeah.
Pilate could grant or withhold that garment, and he often attached conditions. If Caiaphas failed to maintain order, if he allowed an agitator like Jesus to cause a Fru Pilate, could simply say, no garment, no ritual, no Passover.
Wow.
It physically symbolized Roman control over Jewish religious autonomy. It made Caiaphas inherently an agent of the occupation.
So Caiaphas had a powerful, non-negotiable incentive to keep things quiet, and that pressure connects directly to the second massive source of his power, the temple economy.
The temple was immense, one of the largest ancient buildings, but its purpose was singular: animal sacrifice and pilgrimage. And this created a massive, highly lucrative commercial hub that Caiaphas controlled.
Let's spend a moment on the sensory reality of that temple court, because we often picture a serene church, but this was a marketplace.
It was chaos. I mean, imagine the sound of thousands of animals, doves, sheep, oxen bellowing and bleating, the smell of waste and the blood from the sacrifices, the clatter of metal coins. Every pilgrim had to pay an annual temple tax, and it had to be paid in specific temple-approved coinage, which means money changers, with their cut, were essential.
And then there was the animal sacrifice trade.
Which was big business.
Yeah.
Gigantic. The fat and hides were burned, but the meat was shared, ensuring a massive revenue stream for the priests and the merchants who worked under Caiaphas's license.
And into this.
Into this space, Jesus didn't just walk in, he incited the people. He demanded the temple be returned to a house of prayer for all, not a den of robbers run by money changers.
He was attacking Caiaphas's wallet and his political stability at the exact same time.
It was a direct existential attack.
Yeah.
Jesus entered a hornet's nest. And the conflict wasn't purely theological. It was about Deutungshoheit, the authority of interpretation. But it was also deeply about Eitelkeit, or ego, and the massive financial enterprise underpinning the temple's power.
And the sources indicate the high priest was immediately challenged by Pilate after this temple incident.
Oh, Pilate was swift and brutal in his message. If you cannot keep order during the festival, we will do it. And he threatened to withhold the ritual garment until the agitation was resolved.
And that was the moment.
That was the moment Jesus' fate was sealed in the eyes of the Jewish leadership. Caiaphas knew he had to neutralize this instigator, or he would lose his own authority entirely.
Okay, that pressure cooker environment brings us to our next section, the strategic handover. Because what's fascinating here is that Jesus and his disciples, they seem surprised by the initial lack of an official immediate response after the temple cleansing.
Right. They theorized they were being ignored, to prevent an open discussion, a full public hearing that might actually sway the crowds. Jesus, however, would not be ignored.
He demanded they force the issue.
Yes, compelling Caiaphas to bring him before the High Council, the Hohenrat. And he says, no matter how.
And this is where the historical interpretation of Judas changes drastically. I mean, our sources present the traditional evangelical account. Judas betrayed Jesus for money, but they also seriously entertain a second, more complicated theory.
The second theory suggests Judas was not a traitor, but a facilitator. That he was attempting to organize a formal Anhörung, a hearing, before the High Council. The goal, in this view, was not treachery, but tactical brilliance.
So the goal was to continue Jesus's criticism of the temple cult, but in the highest formal setting.
Exactly.
So Judas was facilitating the handover as part of a joint plan. What was the goal of this immense tactical risk?
To convince the Jewish authorities of the urgent need for religious reform by cornering them in a formal debate. And this strategy was allegedly revealed by Jesus during the Passover meal, which later became known as the Last Supper, the Abendmahl.
So when Jesus says, one of you will hand me over, it's not a divine prophecy of inevitable betrayal in this reading.
No, it's a clear affirmation of the plan currently in motion. Judas would arrange the arrest by telling Caiaphas where Jesus would spend the night, ensuring a quiet arrest and the formal Anhörung they wanted.
And they had a tactical safety net, or so they thought, based on their knowledge of Jewish law?
Yes, they knew that the unanimous verdict by the High Council required 2 full days of deliberation. So if the hearing failed and somehow turned into a trial, they believed they would have enough time, 48 hours, to react, to organize their followers, or even to escape.
This paints Jesus as a calculated political strategist.
He was actively seeking this confrontation.
Yeah.
The sources quote him saying, "I will go and face them. That is why we came." The idea was to risk the arrest to gain the platform.
But the plan, if the second theory is true, it failed spectacularly, which leads to the Gethsemane surprise. Jesus leads his followers to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's expecting what? Maybe a quiet delegation of guards to escort him to a formal meeting.
And the arrest happened far earlier and far more violently than they anticipated. The reported reaction now already suggests a complete collapse of their planned timeline.
Right.
This is where the tactical naivety of the reformers collided with the cynical efficiency of the power structures.
I have to pause here. If Jesus was such a good strategist, why would he trust a Romanized religious court, which had already shown its desperation, to honor the 2-day review process? Wasn't that just incredibly naive?
It was a gamble. A gamble based on a profound misunderstanding of his opponent's ruthlessness. Jesus was playing by the formal rules of the Torah and the Hohenrat.
Right.
Caiaphas, however, was playing by the rules of Roman realpolitik and survival.
Right.
The moment Jesus attacked the temple economy, the rules of formal law were suspended.
And the source suggests Judas is shown trying to warn Jesus, saying, "They surprised us." He wasn't surprised by the location. He was surprised by the force and the speed of the arrest.
The authorities did not play by the expected rules. It was a massive, coordinated force. Jewish temple guards working shoulder to shoulder with Roman soldiers. And they were reportedly shouting Gladius Stringite, "Draw your swords," as they moved in to neutralize the agitator before Passover officially began.
So the planned formal hearing instantly became an immediate illegal arrest, orchestrated by a coalition of the Jewish religious leadership and the Roman military presence.
Yes.
This coordination just underscores their shared motivation, maintaining public order above all else.
It transformed Jesus' calculated attempt to force a religious debate into an instant matter of state security. The religious crime of being a false prophet was, for the authorities, a secondary concern to the political crime of causing a disturbance during a volatile festival.
And that strategic shift takes us into the ultimate drama of our next section, the trials, the shift from religious offense to state treason.
The first step was the illegal trial before Caiaphas, immediately after the arrest at the high priest's house. This entire procedure was a legal nightmare by Jewish standards. The violations were extensive.
Such as?
Well, the High Council was meeting at night, in secret and critically, on a festival day. All of these were against the law.
And these violations alone should have nullified any verdict. So why the blatant disregard for their own laws?
Because Caiaphas was operating under an assumption, a loophole, that the law could be suspended if the accused was a verführer, a seducer, a zauberer, a sorcerer, or a false prophet, who leads Israel astray with lies.
So that was his justification.
That was his legal loophole to bypass the 2-day review process and the necessity of public scrutiny.
And the sources paint a vivid picture of the confrontation. It wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a clash of egos.
Jesus called out the high priest for hiding behind the law, the temple walls, and his glorious garments to conceal his arrogance and his chachmat, his hubris.
He was flipping the power dynamic.
He was. He was reminding Caiaphas that the only reason he wore those glorious garments was because Pilate allowed him to. He was exposing the political hypocrisy of the religious establishment, which was ostensibly anti-Roman, but practically dependent on Rome for its power.
And to secure a death verdict, Caiaphas focused on Jesus' prophecy about the temple, that no stone will remain on another.
It was the perfect trap. Caiaphas used this as proof of Jesus being a false prophet and a seducer, and he invited God to judge. If the temple, the symbol of the faith and of Caiaphas's power, fell before morning, Jesus was right. If not,
he was proven false and deserving of death.
And Jesus' response affirmed his mission. Heaven and earth will pass away, even the temple, but my words will not pass away. He understood that the goal was elimination, not deliberation.
So the verdict was immediate
Yes.
and predetermined.
Yes, Jesus should die on the holster shanda, the wood of shame, accursed by God. However, here is the hinge of the entire narrative. The High Council could find him guilty of a capital religious crime, but under Roman occupation, they lacked the authority to carry out the execution.
They had to hand him over to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and that meant the charge had to be reframed to suit Roman jurisdiction.
So the scene shifted that very same morning to the Praetorium, Pilate's seat. And what follows is just a masterful display of cynical political maneuvering by the Jewish authorities. First, the obstruction.
Right.
Caiaphas and the high priest refused to enter the palace itself.
Because entering a Gentile building during Passover would make them ritually impure, preventing them from performing the holy rites.
It's an incredible display of prioritizing ritual purity over justice or even legal necessity. And it forced Pilate, the ultimate authority, to conduct an extraordinary informal procedure outside on the pavement.
And we're told Pilate responded to this ceremonial arrogance by calling them barbarians.
Yes. And this outside procedure served the high priest's strategy perfectly.
Yeah.
They wanted Jesus condemned, away from the massive crowds, and they orchestrated the smaller crowd noise that ensued.
And this is a really critical point that the sources emphasize. We must strictly caution against drawing any conclusion of collective guilt against the Jewish people for Jesus' death. This was a political maneuver driven by the Jewish authorities, Caiaphas, and the high priests, who maneuvered Pilate into doing their dirty work.
That is essential to understand. And to force Pilate's hand, they had to drop the religious charges, blasphemy or false prophecy, because those were irrelevant to Rome and didn't warrant the death penalty under Roman law.
So Caiaphas pivoted.
His brilliance was in the pivot. He skillfully transformed the charge to a political crime, claiming to be king of the Jews. Treason. This successfully converted an internal Jewish dispute over religious conduct into a matter of Roman public order.
Which is something Pilate could not ignore during Passover.
You're not.
And this is the moment Pilate, sitting in his seat of power, asks the central, ultimate question of the case. Do you call yourself king of the Jews?
Jesus' response, according to the accounts, is a masterpiece of complexity. He confirms the title, but adds the profound caveat, "My kingdom is not of this world."
What exactly does that mean in the context of a treason trial?
Our sources suggest this was a highly sophisticated form of passive resistance. Jesus understood the trial was not a search for truth, but a power play designed to secure his elimination.
Okay.
By confirming the title while defining it as non-political, not of this world, he accepted the identity, but he rejected Rome's jurisdiction over that identity. He maintained his dignity and refused to argue on Pilate's terms.
So in his measured silence and passive acceptance, he was inverting the roles.
Precisely. The source argues Jesus understood that Pilate, the mighty Roman prefect, was merely a temporary executor of Caesar's will, and that Pilate would ultimately have to answer to him, the condemned man, for this judgment. It was a profound act of self-witnessing.
The act of a martyr who uses his final moments to give testimony to his values, even if it guarantees his death.
Exactly.
And the testimony of the witnesses sealed the deal. We hear about a woman who testifies she saw Jesus 5 days earlier on the new road to the temple, riding a donkey, praised as the Savior Hoshina and the Son of David.
That independent testimony confirmed the public claim of kingship.
And Jesus' final word on the political charge before the sentence is devastatingly profound in its simplicity.
Disoxtes.
You say it. He refuses to own the title as a Roman definition of a revolutionary leader, but he doesn't deny the identity. He throws the definition back onto Pilate, forcing the governor to take full ownership of the judgment.
And with that, Pilate, leveraging the absolute power granted by Emperor Tiberius, pronounced the sentence. Cum concilio collocutus dico sententiam.
Having consulted with the council, I give the sentence.
Jesus of Nazareth, who proclaimed himself king of the Jews, is condemned to death by crucifixion.
And it was a judgment based purely on political expediency, not criminal guilt as we'd understand it.
No. Pilate had to choose between one agitator's life and the absolute stability of Jerusalem during Passover. He chose stability.
We have meticulously traced the path from the calculated entrance to the brutal political execution. Now, as we move into our conclusion, let's look at the coalition of motives that ensured this outcome and the power of intentional martyrdom.
We've established that Jesus' execution was the result of a perfectly coordinated coalition where the two dominant powers, Rome and the Jewish establishment, found temporary, cynical common ground.
Okay, let's summarize the motives of the Jewish establishment led by Caiaphas.
Their motivation was fundamentally self-preservation. It was driven by protecting their authority, their ego Edelkeit, and the sanctity and, of course, the immense profitability of the temple cult. Jesus threatened all three.
By undermining the laws, exposing their hypocrisy, and attacking their revenue streams.
Yes.
And on the other side, the Roman occupiers, represented by Pilate, they had a singular, brutal motivation.
Maintaining Roman order at all costs, to prevent any hint of rebellion or off-stand during this sensitive festival. Pilate's job was simple. keep the peace, collect the taxes, and execute anyone who claimed a rival kingship.
Jesus was a necessary sacrifice for the sake of imperial stability.
Yes.
But the most profound interpretation that our sources offer circles back to Jesus' own intent, and it asks, was he merely a casualty of this political coalition, or was his death the central objective of his plan?
The sources, especially when you analyze the strategic staging and the failure of that initial hearing plan, they argue that Jesus came to Jerusalem with the plan to die. He was convinced that his death would give the maximum impetus, the Grustin impetus, to his message.
That turns the entire narrative on its head. I mean, if he wanted to reform the temple, dying doesn't look like a victory. But if the goal was maximizing the message, his death is the ultimate engine.
It is a profound strategic sacrifice. And the source compares this action to later historical figures who consciously faced or provoked death to maximize their impact. We're talking about individuals like Martin Luther King Jr., Mahatma Gandhi, or Alexei Navalny.
How are those comparisons tactically relevant here?
Well, they all recognize that the death of the messenger, when witnessed publicly and inflicted by an unjust power, often ensures the message survives the messenger.
And gains far greater power.
Far greater power than any continued life or successful legal battle could achieve. They lose the battle against the established system, but they win the moral and historical war.
So Jesus didn't just passively accept his capture. He intentionally called it forth, even if the timing was off. He knew that the sight of a king of peace being brutally executed by the empire would solidify the moral power of his teachings for future generations.
Precisely. His true victory was ensuring that his message of heart-centered faith and radical reform could not be co-opted or diluted by the corrupt systems he was trying to replace. The execution proved his point about the cruelty of the legalistic and imperial power structures.
And the final irony is the symbol that arose from this execution, the cross itself.
It was a symbol of shame, the holster shande, used only for slaves and serious criminals. Early Christians actively avoided using the cross in their iconography because it was so deeply associated with political torture.
So how long did that last?
It took nearly 3 centuries for that instrument of Roman terror and imperial justice to transform into the global symbol of hope and resurrection that we recognize today. The change is testament to the enduring impetus his death created.
A powerful legacy, born not from a theological miracle, but from a calculated political confrontation that went spectacularly wrong for the reformer, but perfectly right for the message.
We hope this exploration helps you distinguish between the historical, geopolitical facts and the powerful theological interpretations that followed, offering a clearer picture of why this man had to die.
The sources leave us with a provocative thought for you, the listener, to carry forward. We've seen evidence suggesting Jesus was a calculated reformer. We've seen the ruthlessness of the political structures he faced. Considering the strategic staging and the calculation that defined his final week, what does it truly mean when a reformer intentionally turns a religious argument into a political confrontation that he knows will result in his execution? Was the plan, in fact, always to lose the trial but win the war for his message? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.